Well, good morning, everybody, and you're all very welcome to week 4 of the Impact Festival 2020. And this week is being relational. Over 5 weeks, the Centre for Homeless Impact and their partners are creating this space to meet, to explore ideas, learn new skills, and hopefully to build a shared sense of what we want to achieve in homelessness over the coming months and years. The theme for this year's festival is Accelerating Impact, a particularly pressing theme when huge changes and strides have been made in 2020 in response to the pandemic still sweeping the globe. This session, titled The Importance of Relationships in Knowledge, Translation and Implementation, will build upon that theme by exploring the necessity of both good evidence and relationships on good service delivery, more vital than ever as we adjust and adapt to what we're calling the new normal. My name is Pat from Med Trust, who I'm sure you've all heard of. Over the last 9 years, we've been prototyping and testing new approaches to tackle homelessness. And we've found that how you do relationships within services can either facilitate and provide what someone needs to get through a tough time, or alternatively, can lead on to trapping people, institutionalizing people in services. Med's philosophy and approach of strength-based, person-led, transitional very much focuses on the importance of relationships. So I'm very, very delighted to be chairing today, but I want to introduce you now to the star of the shows, our panelists, Des Holmes, Director of Research in Practice, and Jonathan Brecken, Director of the Alliance for Youthful Evidence at Nesta. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Des to give us her 5 to 8 minutes opening presentation. Thanks, Des.
Thank you. Hi, colleagues. My name's Des Holmes and I run an organisation called Research in Practice, and we help people largely within social care and affiliated settings to access and use evidence in their work with children and adults. So we work across the country, as you can see on that map there, and our model is based on kind of multimodal approaches, so helping people use evidence in lots of different ways, and certainly more ways than just reading a long report, because it turns out that's not what works. So I'm going to talk quickly, and I might get more and more Welsh the more excited I get, about just the nature and the importance of thinking relationally when we're trying to enable evidence to be used in practice. One of the things that I would say we've learned quite powerfully since we were set up in 1996 is that simply increasing people's access to evidence is not enough. We could give everybody in the country Athens access, and my personal view is it would make zero difference to most people's practice, and it would certainly make no difference to policy. So that's partly because we don't have a terrifically simple relationship with evidence. You know, within social care, certainly, which is the area that I know more about, we have quite an ambivalent relationship with evidence itself, and we need to tackle that before or alongside funding more and better evidence generation. I want to just be clear at the top here, especially because I don't want to cut across other speakers today, but I'm not arguing against the need for more trials, more RCTs, more evidence generation. I'm saying on its own, it's not enough if we don't also think about the relationships, the connections, and the behaviours. And evidence isn't perfect. The trouble with evidence, and this slide here draws on some work, particularly looking around the health sector. Some would argue that evidence-based practice turns practitioners into technicians. You're following a strict process, you forget the people's values, the circumstances, the nuance, the relational stuff within that. And it can feel pretty unrewarding, like just reheating someone else's ready meal. And that can be pretty demoralizing for some practitioners. There's a whole host of criticisms, perhaps based on misperceptions, to be fair, that are evidenced in the discourse around evidence-based medicine in particular. So it denigrates clinical expertise and ignores people's preferences, and it's a cookbook approach. It's a cost-cutting tool. That's one that we need to be really live to. It's an ivory tower concept, which I think is a justified concern around some evidence generation. And this last one always makes me smile. It can lead to therapeutic nihilism, because if we haven't got loads of RCTs, we don't know what to do, so there's no point doing anything. And oh my God, you can see that playing out a little bit now in the public, where apparently there are people who want 55 RCTs before they wear a mask. It's interesting, I think, to note that we had almost no RCTs in place linking tobacco to lung cancer, but we still took some public health approaches in relation to smoking. So this nihilism that can set in is sometimes about people feeling reticent to change practice. Until you prove it's gold standard, why should I change what I'm comfortable doing? I have a view on masks, that might come up later. So the relationship we have with evidence isn't always easy. This slide here looks particularly around some of the critique from social work and social care. Stephen Webb, they're arguing that this evidence-based rational model decision-making doesn't fit the realities of our very individualized, contextualized practice, and especially, Webb would say, in non-medical practice, where problems are less well-defined. I'm curious to learn later whether that chimes with colleagues who work in the homelessness sector. It certainly does with many in social work. But there's also, I think, a challenge here, because if the nature of our work in social care, in homelessness, in other sectors, is to a large extent relational, it's about how we do things and how we make people feel and how we feel about our work, then we need methods, evidence generation methods, that speak to that. There's a cracking book by Ruush Ilkkonen, which talks about relationship-based research in social work. And in the Briggs chapter, they talk about evidence-based practice as a wedge between research and professional experience. And the hammer that drives home that wedge is a methodological one. On the one side, you've got this evidence-based practice, which is all about quantitative, positivist, experimental, quasi-experimental studies to create evidence of what works. And on the other side, you have this qualitative, observational, naturalistic body of methods, which Briggs would argue speaks much closer to what's important in social work. Again, I wonder how that might resonate with colleagues in homelessness. So if we have a funny relationship with evidence, and the evidence being created may not always use methods that speak to relational practice, you can start to see why this stuff's so tricky. And of course, the third element in which relationships are important is that we don't exist in a vacuum. None of us practice in a vacuum. We're part of organizations, professions, regions, sectoral groups. We're working in very complex systems. And I know that's particularly true for colleagues joining this call. There's few fields more complex, I would say, than homelessness right now. We know that leadership is multifaceted, so that all levels of a system, people can and do exercise leadership around the role of evidence. We know that facilitation of knowledge to action is key. We know that change is emergent. This is very obvious, I think, to people working professional roles, but folks aren't sat there twiddling their thumbs waiting for a Whitehall rubber stamped study to be trickled down to them, sprayed over them, so that they can then do the work that's needed. So there's an argument for much more co-production of knowledge. And crucially, when we're thinking about the role of evidence in affecting our practice and improving our approach, it's key to think not to simplify or control complexity, but to work with it, to lean into it. And I will just caveat, that's Bev Holmes, a much more clever Holmes than myself. I'm not doing a Quelfie, as is sometimes the case. So at Research and Practice, we try to think about these roles of relationships. And so we don't talk about evidence-based practice, we talk about evidence-informed practice, something that Woodbury and Kunk have researched. And what we, in essence, mean by that is the triangulation of robust, relevant research and data, alongside practice expertise or professional wisdom, or sometimes called tacit knowledge, and thirdly, alongside people's lived experience, what Barlow and Scott call service user views, or even more jarring consumer perspective, which rather sticks in my throat, but people's lived experience, the stuff you know because you've gone through it. And when we think about that triangulation, of course, at the core of it, we're trying to think about the professional capacity to assess the presenting issues and to honour self-determination. We don't want people to be passive recipients of our professional intervention, nor do we want professionals to be passive recipients of someone else's clever clogs academic knowledge. This has got to be about co-productive dialogical learning. And that means we have to completely do away with this research into practice construct. And I am aware of the rich irony of the name of my organisation being Research in Practice. It's a terrible name. There you go. One of the reasons why it's such a terrible name, apart from the fact it means that our website looked like an undertaker's for a while, .RIP. One of the reasons why it's so terrible is because it allows us to slip into this idea where scientists get to blame stubborn practitioners for not using evidence. God, they're so resistant, aren't they? And of course, practitioners get to blame those smug scientists in their ivory tower who know naught about the realities of the work we do. So we create quite a divisive culture, which of course doesn't help any of us to be using evidence to best effect. There is this fallacy of the pipeline, this idea that clever folk over here make the evidence and they fire it down the scientific pipeline. They spray it onto these passive professionals who will then do the better work because they have been coated with someone else's knowledge. And of course, that leads to this fallacy of the empty vessel, the practitioner is passive. And so Green is very strong on really disrupting that whole notion. And certainly from my experience, and I suspect it's true of your sector, there are no more stubborn practitioners or smug scientists than there are really, really passionate, evidence-hungry professionals who get up every single day keen to learn and do their role even better than the day before.
1 minute.
Thank you. Speaks to values. We need absolutely to be thinking about evidence in an expansive sense, collaborative social learning, relational dialogical learning, co-produced knowledge, where, nod to my colleague there, Jonathan, Nesta advised us to get away from professional experts and think about wider consultation. If we want more evidence-based practice, we need more practice-based evidence. So we need to get away from passive dissemination and think about interaction, social influence, facilitation, incentives. We could do well to steal from Unilever. They've spent bajillions of pounds on psychology, so we don't have to. They would suggest there are 5 key levers for change. If we don't help the sector understand and find it easy to use evidence, they will not find it desirable, rewarding, or indeed make it a habit. This is not about spraying practitioners with academic knowledge. And we need this absolutely mobilised at all levels of the system because relationships are core to what we do. And I will just finish by saying it has to happen at every level of the system. It's got to be hip to be square where you work. We need nerds in every single office, in every single setting, because the geeks shall inherit the earth, colleagues. We need the use of evidence woven in, not bolted on. You want to speak to people's sense of ikigai. Apologies to any Japanese speakers. That's about our reason for being, our reason for getting up in the morning. People get up to help people, not always to contribute and further the evidence base. And finally, just a note to any senior colleagues out there in the audience, as I always say to social care leaders trying to build a different relation with evidence, as George Harrison tells us, it's going to take time, a whole lot of precious time, and it's going to take money to do it right. Thanks.
Thanks, Des, so much there. I've got to say that we've got one of those cool dudes, Ashraf is his name. We invested in a social impact guy a few years ago. So lots to debate on, but without further ado, going to ask Jonathan to speak before we go into the panel. Very welcome, Jonathan. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Pat. I'm going to speak about 3 things. One is about the importance of relationships, but both in terms of how to communicate evidence to the front line, to the policymakers, to professionals, but also why relationships comes up so much as actually the intervention itself that can be so influential in making a difference. The second thing I want to talk about is the sort of wider evidence, and Des has really touched on a lot of this, but the sort of evidence on evidence. And we commissioned a systematic review with the Wellcome Trust and all the available evidence that's out there. And I'm going to give some sort of highlights of that. And then finally, I'm going to briefly say how COVID-19 has turbocharged the whole evidence translation, communication, exchange area. But firstly, I'm the director of the Alliance for Useful Evidence, which has been going for 8 years now, extraordinary. And we do training, advice, thought leadership, but always working with allies and partners. And one of the things that's come up is how you find good quality evidence and what is what are the common denominators you often find around the most promising practices and policies. And relationships is so often one of them. And it can be quite controversial. There's been a lot of work in psychology, for instance. They said it's almost meaningless what type of psychotherapeutic approach, whether you're Freudian or cognitive behavioral, it's about the quality of relationship. It can be about things like self-efficacy, having an adult-to-adult relationship with the homelessness practitioner, the nurse, the doctor, instead of being these what did Des call it? The passive vessels, the empty vessels of the client, of the homeless person, of whoever it is, but actually having a more equal relationship and having a really high quality relationship, and the time to invest in that can have an extraordinary impact. And it used to be dismissed as the placebo effect or the bedside manner in health. But actually we're taking it much more seriously, that relationship element of things. So that's one really important reason that relationships are important. The second area is about the communication. And Des has touched on a lot of this, about how, the idea that we can just do a dissemination model is dead. It just does not work. Talk about RAP, putting it on a portal. In international development, they call it portal proliferation syndrome, i.e. the World Bank or the UN body's got this great available evidence. We'll get some nice designers, press release it, short synthesis, summary. It doesn't work. Yeah, we need richer relationships there. And to touch on some of the bigger evidence on evidence, we did a piece of work called The Science of Using Science, where we did 2 systematic reviews. Actually, one was more of a scoping study to find all the available research and research use. A lot of it has to be said was from the health field, but not all of it. And in the end, we actually stole a model, which I find incredibly helpful. At the time, I thought, oh, not another model. There's gazillions of different frameworks, toolkits, models on how to apply evidence in practice. But this one was from Professor Susan Michie, who's actually become a bit of a star, certainly in the geek world around COVID, because she's been quite an outspoken critic of things like SAGE and some of the government policies. But she's a social psychologist based at UCL. And there's 3 things which I think can be very helpful when looking at relationships and evidence use. And they are capacity, motivation, and opportunity. And they're a way of packaging up, being a little bit of a heuristic about thinking about the different ways we're going to engage with evidence into policy and practice. But if you don't have a cocktail of approaches, if you're only going to do one thing like capacity building, like training, it's not enough. We need a blended model that is concerned with all those 3 areas of capacity, motivation, opportunity. Now, what do I mean by those? Capacity is the ability to understand the evidence. We've seen that in COVID-19. I've certainly struggled with some of the statistics around risks, what it means to, for one hospital to have a percentage of a risk assessment. We have to have that smart consumer who is able to critically engage with research. And that can be quite empowering. Again, going back to Des's point, not being that empty vessel, but being not only a critical engager with the research, but perhaps even producing it, or certainly being close to it. So capacity is crucial, but that's also linked to motivation, the second area. There is no point doing the evidence if you feel you're being forced to do it. Can you have that intrinsic motivation to engage with it? My late father-in-law was a doctor and psychiatrist. And even after he was retired, he loved research. He loved the cutting edge. And he found that very motivating and part of being a professional. Can we have that in other professions, whether it's working with homelessness, social care, teaching? I was part of something called the Society for Evidence-Based Policing, which was middle-ranking police officers who deliberately wanted to be separate from all the big government quangos, or even the researchers, their own ivory towers. And they wanted to help each other in a community of practice to engage with research and actually sort of push back at their leaders. So a very engaged, motivated group. Thirdly, and finally, on this synthesis of all the evidence we found there, one way of seeing things is about opportunities to engage with research. There's no point having the capacity or the motivation if there's no chance to find it, to access it. Now, we often dismiss access because it's not enough in itself. But if there's no time and there's no structures in your day, then it's going to be really tricky to make it have any impact. And to give you a practical example, we did some ethnography, literally going in the footsteps of some social workers, going into homes to see how they might engage with research evidence. And blindingly obvious to the social worker, but you know, the feedback we got is like, I don't have time to access any portal. I'm driving to my clients. I'm not allowed to bring in certain pieces of technology into the home. Hey, and you know what? Even my office bans certain pieces of Apple technology, so I can't access your thing. So that we almost kind of mundane practicality of having the opportunities to access evidence is something we need to think about. So capacity, motivation, opportunity, we need a mixture of that. And we have synthesized hundreds of studies that kind of come up with these messages. A mixture of those three is crucial. I'm going to finish on one thing, which is around COVID, and I'd be really interested to hear other people's views on this. The more positive element of COVID and how it's made us think about evidence is it's really turbocharged the communication element of it. We're now taking the psychology and public health messaging much more seriously. The World Health Organization has been banging on for years, particularly around things like SARS, that we needed to bring in the expertise of social science, psychologists, behavioral insights. And SAGE, the expert committee, does have a subcommittee with the extraordinary name of SPI-B, which sounds like a B-movie type spy film or something, but they are actually a really good group of social scientists that use behavior research. They've even got historians, ethicists, and a sociologist on it. And they've really tried to think hard about how messages land with populations, including socioeconomic groups, rather than just sort of naively thinking we're going to have some press officer number 10 sending out messages and hoping it will land. Now, they've also been some of their members, including Susan Michie, who I mentioned earlier, who's part of that SPI-B committee. They've been quite critical of some of the communication, but it is still welcome that they've been thinking hard about how these messages land. Yeah, social distancing, or not getting so much loo paper from your Sainsbury's. We all have to think about the human element, how we interact as human beings, our relationships, not just one-to-one, but as communities, neighborhoods, towns and countries, indeed globally. So it's really good to see how important that's been, and also how we've turbocharged the creation and synthesis of evidence. There are live living maps of evidence on COVID. And people are now doing systematic reviews that used to take months, even years, in a matter of weeks. It shows what you can do when you can really pump resources into a particular challenge. Wouldn't it be great if we could pump that effort and commitment into something like homelessness? So I'll finish that.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I think we'll pick up other views on the COVID as we go along. We do welcome questions and any comments from the audience. So if you'd like to ask questions, please pop it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll put it to the panelists at the end of the next session. Just to remind you that the hashtag for the festival is CHIFest 2020. So please do get involved in the conversation there too. Now we're going to spend about 15-20 minutes just on some topics that we think are interesting, beginning with what methods are effective in getting knowledge used and embedded in services. And I just wanted to make a comment, because one of the things that was transformative for Mayday over the last number of years is that quite inadvertently, we evolved our own methodology of deep listening, which we called Wisdoms. And this is when we had conversations with people about services. So we didn't ask questions, and we didn't have focus groups. We just sat on the street or wherever people were at, and we just really recorded these conversations. And the strength of the themes that came out, which were very not what we expected, transformed everything, every aspect of how Mayday operated over the last number of years. So I think that in terms of how powerful getting knowledge embedded in services is not to be underestimated. And certainly it continues to feed and inform our strategic direction. I'd like now to pass it over to Jonathan and Des for their comments. Thank you. Who wants to go first? Des.
Oh, I was offering to Jonathan. So, I mean, I can speak from our experience in research and practice. One of the things some of the things that have been really key to us in trying to help people engage with evidence is having multiple methods by which you do that. So reports are not enough. I mean, when was the last time you sat down in your spare time and read a 57-page report? You know, it's just not viable. And I think there's a lack of humility that comes with that we can produce our very clever reports and we'll put a nice glossy cover on it. And then these people who are being paid sometimes very little with very little time will somehow find time to read it. So trying to think about quite creative and innovative transmission methods, but also thinking about, and this has been really important for our learning, multi-level approaches. So there is, in my personal view, very little sense whatsoever in sheep dip training or passive dissemination at practice level. Let's all be trauma informed if you're not also trying to enable trauma informed supervision, trauma informed leadership, trauma informed commissioning, and hey, let's be bold, trauma informed policy making. So thinking about the systemic nature of this has been really key, and that's been key to us. But I would say that it doesn't matter how whizzy and fantastic your communication methods are, if the evidence or knowledge you're trying to share does not feel relevant and resonant, and that's really key. I think it speaks to a conversation we were having before about whose evidence, you know, whose purpose is being served by the evidence we're trying to generate. And if it's not in service to those that we're, you know, whose lives we're trying to impact on positively, and it's not in service to those who are doing, and I will say this, the real work, who's it for? You know, who's it for? Vanity projects for people like me, because I quite want to do a study. We've got to think about the purpose of knowledge and the audience for that knowledge, and then think about the transmission or communication methods. But even more crucially, of course, we shouldn't even be into communication transmission, because it should be co-productive in the first place. It should be about shared creation of knowledge. So things like Nesta do very similar things, but we have change projects where kind of iterative action learning meets action research. So you're not thinking about dissemination at the end of creating something, you're thinking about implementation from the point of conception. And I think that is easy to say and hard to do, but essential to do.
Jonathan, do you want to add to that? Or
yeah, I do. I think a kind of crucial message is and this is from the evidence, it's not just me saying this, although I've spent the last 20 years, longer actually, we're trying to help nudge research into policy and practice. But there is no one single quick fix. It's kind of obvious, but you know, we run the training on evidence for the policy profession across the entire civil service, and it always breaks my heart. That's all we do. We sort of parachute it into some government department, and then we jump away again. And it's not enough, because it's one single thing. You need a cocktail of measures, and it's working with those practitioners, those systems. And I'll give you one example of how I've seen it can be very useful to work in, I don't want to use the jargon of sort of co-creation, but that's what it is. It's working alongside and with practitioners. And we did something with some social workers where we actually went upstream and helped design the research questions that we wanted others to help answer. And it's kind of sort of blindingly obvious, but actually shook the academics out of some of their comfort zones, in that a lot of the questions are being asked were about how can we help with the morale of frontline practitioners and stop the terrible attrition rates of people falling out of the profession. This happened to be social work. And indeed, there's about 10 years ago, there was something called What Works for Children. And they did this thing that felt radical at the time, at actually asking frontline practitioners, what's helpful for you? What would be the questions you want asked? And they weren't the ones that academics were, and they were the same sort of things. So actually using evidence that can help with something like managing the stress of your job is not how we often think about these things. We usually think about it as interventions and programs out there, but can we help the morale and well-being of the people that are so crucial to this, actually the people on the front line, I think could be a really good way ahead.
Thank you. Our second topic is, what role do relationships and the strength of them play in knowledge translation?
I go first this time. Yeah, I mean, they're just so crucial. But there's something I really want to stress on the relationship front, which is, there's two things. One is it's the quality of relationships. It's getting to quality of adult to adult, really. And this is where you need the systems to enable it, because so often people say, yeah, I'd love to do that, but I just don't have time. I have 30 seconds to deal with my client or patient or whoever it might be. But having that quality relationships, including, if it's from the research, trying to have a two-way dialogue with a practitioner or the public or policymaker. So the quality of that, and I'm afraid often it's about the quantity, having the time so you can not have a stressful, time-limited relationship is crucial. The second point is it's almost the dark side of relationships, which I want to bring up, which is we do need to be wary of our own cognitive biases. Me as a sort of highly privileged white male, and the relationships I might have with others, there might be a whole bunch of things going on that evidence can show can create some real difficulties and biases that I might be unconscious of, but also I can mitigate. There's a lot of evidence that bringing in diverse voices helps to get out of groupthink and make better decisions, whether you're sat on a committee or whatever it might be. So it's quite empowering, but quite radical just to see that evidence is about your relationship and be super aware of some of the unconscious oppression. Yeah, and there's really robust evidence about that. Whether you're a naive positivist who wants to RCT everything or qualitative. So bring in that wariness of your relationships. And that's particularly relevant perhaps if you're a policymaker or in a London-based charity, and you're going to researchers, and actually you're going to the same type of researchers. And it's been a real wake-up call for SAGE to realize that actually they had very little representation from BAME communities, who are some of the hardest hit on COVID-19. So in being super aware of the potential biases of your relationships.
And is that, because that really echoes with me, Jonathan, but the difficulty I have when people say about quality relationships is often when you look at, and we've looked as we walk alongside people, the unconscious bias, but also the other sort of power dynamics. How can you have a quality with relationship with someone who you have got the power to evict? How can you have a quality relationship with a funder who has the power to stop giving you money? And it's all of those other things within the system that impact on that relationship, as well as time. But I don't know what you feel about that, Des.
Time's certainly a factor, but I guess time is really another way of saying prioritization. If we were serious about the use of evidence and the co-creation application of knowledge as being part of the day job, rather than a thing you have to find time for because your day job is so busy, that's a kind of fairly fundamental difference. I would really agree with the point about what Jonathan was at the dark side of relationships, and like you, Pat, I was thinking about that from the lens of the practice relationship with the people we serve. And I think there can be all sorts of downsides, blind spots and pitfalls in relation to that, collusive practice, the savior complex stuff, the rescue mentality, the power dynamics that can be quite unhealthy within that. And I think that can get played out in all sorts of other levels. I do think relationships are key to helping people use evidence. I think credibility matters. There was that old adage, wasn't there, in sales, that people buy from people. I think I might have just quoted David Brent. God. But I think it does bear out to some extent in evidence. If there are evidence creators that we know, understand, rate, if we believe they have credibility within our field, within our sector, if we think they've actually walked the same path we have walked, all of these things matter. It's not enough to just be clever. All of these things do matter. I would say the most significant relationship, perhaps for practitioners, though, is the one they have with their manager and the one they have with their profession overall. If core to your professional pride is knowing your onions, then it's not about making time to engage with evidence. That's what you do, because your sense of ikigai is about doing the best job you possibly can. And that point about managers, the relationship we have with our immediate manager is shown to be hugely influential in all sorts of things, like from well-being and resilience, as Jonathan was touching on, but also in the nature of the relationship we have with evidence. There's a really depressing headline from an article in Community Care a couple of years ago, where a student social worker tipped up on their placement to be told on day one, "You won't need any of that theory nonsense around here, love. I've added the love, because I think that's probably what happened." And that was only a couple of years ago. So we do need to recognise the power of the relationship you have with your profession and with your manager. But there's also something about, as you touched on there, Pat, the role that commissioners and funders can play in this. There's a lovely line in the work of Toby Lowe and Dawn Plimmer. They're big into human learning systems thinking. And they make this really bold, ambitious, aspirational claim that the purpose of commissioning is not to buy services tile by tile, slice by slice, as Kathy Evans would say. It's to build and buy capacity for learning and adaptation. That's what you're commissioning. You're commissioning an alliance of organisations, professionals and people who are trying to change systems and change the world, nothing short of it. And I think that done well can leverage incredibly powerful and important and positive relationships. Done badly, it's exactly as Jonathan describes. Jobs for the boys, same old people doing the same old stuff. And as you describe, practitioners in not terribly healthy relationships with their work or the people they serve.
Yes, great, thank you. So the next topic is, how can you build mutual understanding and agreement on questions that need to be addressed and the kind of evidence needed to answer them?
I mean, I don't want to sound too motherhood and apple pie, but surely it would start with the people we serve. Because what matters most to Jonathan or myself or the Secretary of State or, an individual academic, is all terribly interesting, but it's nothing compared to what people need. So people like the James Lind Alliance, when they're looking at, for example, the adult social care research priorities, they did a huge amount of work to find out from people who use services or need to use services or care and love people who are using services. And you start from there. You start from what are the problems we're trying to solve, what are the strengths we've got to build on, not what is the current policy trend. We don't in my view, want policy-informed evidence. We don't want to be driven from that direction. So there are techniques used. You know, the James Lind Alliance is a really established organisation in that sense. There are techniques that are entirely, but on a local level, I'm always surprised by how few organisations design their training and learning and development programme each year based on evidence from their complaints and compliments log. I'm astonished how few organisations actually do a learning needs analysis before they spend however many pounds on commissioning training. So there are some quite simple ways in which we could adopt that sense of problem definition before trying to create knowledge. I mean, Jonathan, you've probably got a much more erudite response you can offer to that.
Can I ask you first, Des? Sorry, what interests me is I do think that you start with, I believe we start with people we serve. One example that I had as we went along is that when we talked to people years ago, because I've been around much too long, people said in homeless day centres, they had horrific experiences in doctor's surgeries. And the solution was to bring GPs into homeless day centres. Now, what this has turned into is a whole homeless industry that absolutely isolates it and creates huge psychological barriers for people to get out of homeless services. So I think there's a sort of literal listening to what people are saying, and I just wondered what sort of techniques. I mean, I think your diagram of bringing that sort of research and the you know, the practitioner and the voices of people going through systems, really that sort of co-creation that both you and Jonathan have talked about, is that the sort of, because I think there's that literal listening isn't quite getting us where we need either.
No, it's not. And I think that, and this is, I'm going to get pilloried for this. I think we need to think really critically about how we use expertise from lived experience. I think it's not terribly helpful. I mean, in my sector, we tend to see it where you stick a kid in a conference and everyone nods along, even when they might be saying things that are completely not correct. But, oh, it's terribly important that young people are speaking. And actually, they deserve more respect than that. I think the people we serve have all sorts of really valid and important knowledge, but that doesn't mean it should be accepted uncritically. There should be debate, negotiation, dialogue, you know, kick the tires a bit. You know, daycare centres and adult social care is a really good example of that. We did a really nice piece of work actually with a group of local authorities and voluntary sector organisations around recurrent care proceedings, mothers who'd had more than one children, sometimes, you know, many children removed from them. And it was a very interesting exercise in bringing together academic knowledge, practice wisdom, and of course the people who'd experienced that incredible trauma had a very particular view. It's an important view. It's not necessarily the only view that should guide policy and service design. And I would say that part of respecting people is treating their knowledge with the same critique that you would any other source of knowledge. It's not about patronizing or condescending to it. It's about, and I would also say that some of the stuff that we knew best then, it will change. That's not because evidence has failed or any individual has failed. It's because stuff moves on. You know, we know more each day.
Jonathan, sorry.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting, important area. In terms of sort of the techniques, Pat, you mentioned about how you go about listening to people with lived experience or the front line. Just to plug a report, we've got a summary of the techniques called Evidence versus Democracy, and it looks at a whole range of quite robust techniques, whether they're sometimes called mini publics, things like citizen juries or assemblies or Delphi panels. They've got lots of technical terms, but what they're trying to do is get away from the common mistake, which is we listen to people who shout loudest, or we do a bog standard tokenistic consultation, which actually ends up being people who have some vested interest in your sector. The really radical version of a mini public is actually you wouldn't engage totally with people around homelessness, but actually a random selection of the public. But, and here's the thing that's related to relationships, you have to have a really honest relationship that goes on a journey so that they understand the complexity of homelessness or funding. And that takes time. You might have to pay people for their time. There have been several examples where it's worked very effectively, very time intensive, but it's a heck of a lot better way than listening than, say, monitoring social media or just bringing in one GP into your consultation panel. So I really think they're worth investing in, but they are blooming hard. But it was great to see that things like the Select Committee on Health and Social Care did one on the funding of social care. When you get into complex issues, which is the field we're in, where there aren't any simple answers, trying to get really rigorous and fair, but above all, listen to those people that you spent all that time. You know, how many consultations have I done where you just, you know, you get ignored because you're one of hundreds, but actually listening to people who are really invested in their time and making sure they're taking their, almost their citizen duty seriously to help you. That would be my dream, but maybe that's naive.
If I may, Pat, just as well, building on Jonathan's point there, we shouldn't, in our discussion around co-production or relationship building, we shouldn't imagine that there are three separate populations: the people who make the evidence, the professionals who use it, and the people we serve. Academics also have a practice background. Practitioners will often have lived experience. So to just being careful we don't fall into that trap of thinking the mutually exclusive groups.
That's a really important point. Thanks, Des. Okay, I'm going to take some questions from the audience now, and I'm going to start with one from Andrew Hudson. How do we get co-production as far upstream as possible, i.e. working with practitioners to identify the topics where they would find better evidence helpful?
So I have a first go. So I'll just give you a really practical example. It's from something called the What Works Centre for Children's Social Care. And we use something called a Delphi panel, which I won't get into the details, but again, it was something a little bit more structured to go right upstream to say, what are the questions that we should be going out there and testing? What matters to you? But instead of just going to the usual suspects, we worked really hard to make sure we get a representative group that could feed in. So Delphi panel would be one, but Des might have other ideas.
Now, in the Delphi panel is a great example, but I would also say that it's not all of us can do this stuff at scale. So for many colleagues on this call, you'll be thinking about just within your organization or within your team or within your city or borough, you know, thinking about how you engage them. And I suppose there's two things. One is about being as inclusive as possible, not just asking the usual suspects. You can't just go to your resident geeks. Of course, they're going to contribute, but you need to get to the people, you need to get to the cynics. You need to get to the common sense warriors who don't believe you need that theory nonsense around here, love, you know? So really thinking expansively. This is a sales and PR job as much as it's any kind of academic exercise, and we shouldn't be ashamed of that. But I also think there is, back to Jonathan's point about an honest conversation, for very good reasons, often our people who are in direct practice are focused on that sphere of work, and they may not always be able to think very systemically or strategically about what the key knowledge creation priorities are, and that's okay. And we at Research in Practice, we run an annual, incredibly labour-intensive consultation exercise to choose our topics each year. And one of the complexities that we grapple with is respecting practitioner views, because they absolutely have such invaluable knowledge, but also sometimes pushing back. So the example in my sector is we want more stuff on disguised compliance, which is a dreadful term. It's morally bankrupt and it's also grammatically incorrect. Different seminar. So finding ways to respectfully say, actually, no, we're not going to focus on that because there are all sorts of flaws. I understand why you think you need it, but it's actually quite a flawed notion. And I do think that, again, that respectful, constructive exchange is key. But we should also think about the wider system here. You know, if we want practitioners to be co-producing, co-creating around the questions that matter, that necessarily has to include the people we serve, what matters most to them. And we do need it role models to us from the very top. So, you know, organisations need to be co-producing their strategic goals. They need to be co-producing their theory of change. Ideally, we'd have policymakers co-producing policy imperatives. This stuff does need to be done from the top with feeling, and not just, you know, focus groups that the usual suspects will go to. And I think be prepared to fail. Be prepared to put out consultations, surveys, ideas, focus groups. Be prepared to put your heart and soul into something and be told we're too busy, and dust yourself off and get back up again and try something else. This is an exercise in resilience, as much as one in research generation.
Thank you for that. We've got a question from Alex Smith. How do we share power more effectively, and how do we measure the quality of a relationship?
I actually don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but I happen to know there's someone in the audience who runs an early help service in a London borough who has, for the last couple of years, been trying to devise an approach by which they assess the quality of relationship between work and family. So heads up, Becca, someone might pick on you in a moment. Can I do that? Is that allowed, Pat? But that point about how do we share power, if we were to be really tough on ourselves, even that notion is flawed, because that still corroborates the idea that I have it and it is mine to bequeath. So we need to kind of get even more fundamental about the notion of power, how it's instilled in us, how it's ascribed to us, how it's attributed to us, and whose it is to share in the first place. I suspect, Pat, that you'll be better than any of us in discussing how you've done that in an organisational way.
I do. We did have a conversation earlier on, and it's very noticeable that there isn't enough time and space for people at the front line of services to have that sort of personal development and what Jonathan described as the sort of dark side of relationships, the anti-oppressive practice, all of that. It starts with that self-awareness, and that's sort of key to enabling that sort of power to be taken by people when we share that information and knowledge. And I think that's why it's so important for us all to be here today having these discussions.
I think that's absolutely right, Pat. And the thing that where evidence can help you about that self-awareness, though, is that challenge as well, and that we're very good at being hypocrites or having cognitive dissonance. We can't help it. We're human beings, right? So we might have the best intentions, and you'll certainly see this with researchers who are, very much about empowerment and critically engaging with the whole neoliberal conspiracy, but actually their own behavior doesn't really follow those aspirations. And I think this is where evidence can help, where you can look for things like particular nudges or particular techniques where you can mitigate your biases, but also you can get external evidence that can show that actually you might hope to be trying to change the power balance, but it ain't working. Evidence is challenging like that. The best intentions, but actually, you know what, your organization is still not diverse. But in terms of how we measure relationships, there is a whole body of work on that, and there's surveys that you can use that measures things like trust and responsiveness and the quality of the interpersonal relationship. The key thing here is, and actually it's my partner who can't hear. She can train this with people like doctors and surgeons to how to be a good human being. And what's great is we're taking this so much more seriously. And there's a big center in Harvard University. There's a center for the study of the placebo, which we just used to be so dismissive of these things, even in medicine. And we're now taking that relationship so much more seriously. And I find that really empowering, because it's about the practitioner and about that relationship. It's not about the program, the project, or the pill. It's about the relationship.
Thank you. Final question from Catherine Buglas. Des, I'm intrigued about your view on masks.
Yeah, I think I am pro-mask, I should be clear. But I think masks for me kind of are a perfect example of that nihilism we can fall into when the evidence isn't kind of clear cut for us. So we have, it's a great example of policymakers doing that thing that sometimes happens where they're introducing a thing, but we might question their intentions given the time at which it was done. If something's urgent, you don't wait months for doing it. And if something's really important, then you also issue guidance on how to use it. The number of people down my street who are wearing it below their nose makes my blood boil or run cold, I'm not sure which. So it's a good example of how a policy intervention is done, which may or may not be really rooted in the evidence about what makes evidence get used, or evidence on evidence, as Jonathan said. But I also think the public are absolutely falling into that kind of well-rehearsed, well, it's a national sport for us now, isn't it? Divisive rhetoric, and masks have just become the new culture war, where people hold incredibly passionately held positions with actually very little evidence. We are in a post-factual, post-truth world where apparently feelings matter as much as facts. God help us all. So my personal example is my mother, who I'm quite concerned. While she certainly has the capacity and the opportunity to wear a mask, I believe her motivation is low because, sorry, Mum, she loves wearing lipstick, and I think she might love it a little bit more than she loves being healthy and safe. So using all my best knowledge about how to get knowledge used, I bought her an incredibly vain and beautiful peacock-themed mask for her birthday. And I will write to her, Jonathan, saying, I'm working on your motivation in the absence of you working on your capacity and opportunity. There is science behind this. But to come at my early point, we shouldn't be waiting for 50,000 gold standard trials to cover our faces when sneezing kills. Some stuff doesn't need a study underneath it before we try to test out our approaches. And I would say relationship-based practice might be a good example of that. We do it because it's the right thing to do, not because a lovely big report's landed on our desk telling us to do it. I'm not on commission for those peacock masks, I should be clear, sorry.
Thank you, Des. I have thoroughly enjoyed the discussion on quality relationships, on co-production of knowledge, on the blended model of engagement. I love the phrase evidence-informed from evidence-based. So it just leaves me to say a huge thank you to Des and Jonathan for really stimulating conversation, which I don't want it to end. But thank you all for being a great audience and for all of your questions and for your interest. And yes, look forward to carrying on the conversation. Thank you. Bye.